we have an hour and a half scheduled, and we want to get through everything as expeditiously as possible. Welcome, everybody, to the second session of Delaware Naturally Spring into Action, our virtual summit series, which is a reimagined version of what was meant to be an in-person meeting last year. We were hoping to have this kickoff meeting for Delaware Naturally and to start to figure out ways that our conservation community can better work together. And so last week we had a wonderful kickoff session with wonderful speeches, presentations from Colin O'Mara and Doug Tallamy and Senator Hansen and Jim White, and the governor spoke and signed the invasive species legislation into law, which is a great accomplishment and a great step forward for conservation in Delaware. And we wanted to leverage that motivation into a couple of working meetings. So this week, we're going to be talking about conservation in natural areas. And then next Wednesday, we have the third of this series is going to be a workshop on conservation in the built environment. But for today, what we're hoping to do is very briefly, we have a very tight format today of a couple of introductory presentations to talk about what's at stake in conservation in Delaware. So we have our esteemed state botanist, Bill McAvoy, here to talk a little bit about the flora of Delaware, and esteemed botanist and member of the Native Species Commission, Matt Sarver, to talk a little bit about the wildlife implications of the native species that we have here. And then from that, we're going to go into the real work of today's meeting, which is roundtable discussions, where we will break everybody magically into small groups on your video chat, and we will have a couple of questions about collaboration in conservation that we would like everyone to think about for hopefully about a half an hour or so. And then after that, we're going to come back together into one big meeting and read out the results from the different small groups and start to think about next steps for how do we leverage the conservation community in Delaware. Colin O'Mara last week did such a phenomenal job of teeing this up by pointing out just how many conservation resources we have here in Delaware and the expertise that we bring to this project. So we start from a very strong position, but we want to take what we do and figure out how do we make it even better, and how do we better protect the biodiversity that we have in this richly biodiverse state, as it happens, even though it's not the largest. So to kick things off today, the first thing we wanted to do is get a little introduction and sort of whet our appetite for conservation with an introduction to the flora of Delaware with Bill McAvoy. So Bill, I will stop sharing my screen and you can take it away.
So as botanist for DNREC, Division of Fish and Wildlife, I am responsible for the study and conservation of rare species. And that's what I will be focusing my short presentation on. I don't have a whole lot of time, so I can't go into too much detail. And I have to talk very, very fast. So let me start by identifying the primary causes of species rarity. That would be habitat destruction, degradation, and fragmentation, and non-native invasive species. Now, Delaware consists of 2,339 species and varieties, collectively known as taxa. Of that number, 1,615 are native. Of that number, 585 taxa are rare in the state of Delaware. So 36% of our native flora is rare. And if that number is not alarming to you, it should be. Additionally, 156 taxa are historical in the state, meaning they have not been seen or reported anywhere in Delaware for at least 20 years. And there are 41 taxa that are thought to be extirpated in Delaware, meaning that they are extinct within the state of Delaware, never to be found again. So collectively, the historical and extirpated species make up 12% of our native flora. That is also another alarming figure. Continuing, there are 65 taxa, native taxa in Delaware known from only a single occurrence or population. And many of these populations consist of only a few individuals. You wipe out that population, the species becomes extirpated in Delaware. And there are 33 taxa that are globally rare throughout the world. 7 taxa that are listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as either endangered or threatened. Now, I mentioned that one of the primary causes of species rarity are non-native invasive species. 30% of the overall flora of Delaware is non-native, 724 taxa. Of that number, 75 are invasive, and there are 72 that are watch list invasive, meaning that they are not yet well established or widely distributed in the state, but we are keeping an eye on them. So collectively, the invasive and watch list species make up 20% of all the non-native taxa in Delaware. Now, the majority of our rare plants in Delaware are wetland plants, 279 taxa. So 48% of all our rare plants here in Delaware occur in wetlands. And a wetland plant are those species that have a wetland indicator status of either obligate, FAC wet, or FAC plus. Now, the majority of the rare wetland plants occur in non-tidal freshwater wetlands, 210 taxa. So 75% of all our rare wetland plants are found in non-tidal freshwater wetlands. And here's some examples of non-tidal freshwater wetlands in Delaware. Interdune depression meadows found along the Atlantic coast, Piedmont Stream Valley wetlands in northern Newcastle County, peatland fens, which is a globally rare habitat type. We have forested wetlands or swamps, such as bald cypress swamps, Atlantic white cedar swamps, black ash sheephead swamps, and coastal plain seasonal ponds. Now, I'd like to focus a bit on coastal plain seasonal ponds. Now, these are wetlands that develop in depressions within forested areas, and they are not permanent bodies of water. They're only seasonally flooded. They're typically flooded in the winter and spring when the ponds are flooded, and dry in late summer, early fall. And this flooding and drawdown is related to fluctuating groundwater levels. It's flooded when the groundwater level is high, dry when the groundwater level is low. And these fluctuating groundwaters is what drives the ecology of these ponds. This is an aerial image of a forest block showing a complex of seasonal ponds. Each one of those black dots is a coastal plain seasonal pond. And this is down in southwestern Newcastle County, Blackbird State Forest. So these seasonal ponds are hotspots for rare wetland plants. 22% of all rare wetland plants occur in coastal plain seasonal ponds, 60 taxa. Now, as I mentioned, they're typically flooded in winter and spring when the groundwater table is high. And as the season progresses, the groundwater table begins to drop. You have less precipitation, higher rates of evapotranspiration. And by late summer, early fall, the ponds are dry. And soon after drawdown, you get an explosion of vegetative growth. Now, I'd like to focus on this rare wetland plant of seasonal ponds, Houghtonia inflata, featherfoil. Now, this is an annual species, and the seeds germinate when the ponds are dry in late summer, early fall, and these basal rosettes develop. And these rosettes will overwinter, even in standing water when the ponds are flooded. In early spring, when the ponds are flooded, from that basal rosette, a long stem begins to grow towards the water surface. And then when it reaches the water surface, it flowers. The stems are hollow to help it float, and the feather-like leaves at the base of the plant also help it to float. So it flowers when the ponds are flooded in the spring, it sets seed. Seeds mature, they drop from the plant, they float down through the water column, and they come to rest on the bottom of the pond, where they sit and wait for the ponds to draw down in late summer, early fall, and then the seeds germinate, basal rosette develops, and the whole process repeats itself. So this is a rare plant that is entirely dependent on these fluctuating groundwater levels in order to complete its life cycle. And it's entirely dependent on these ponds for its survival. Now, not only are these ponds important for rare wetland plants, but they are also critically important breeding areas for amphibians. When the ponds are flooded in the winter and spring, amphibians from the surrounding forests come down to the ponds to breed and lay their eggs. Since these ponds are not permanent bodies of water, there's no fish in them. If there were fish in them, they would eat the eggs that they lay. And you have rare species such as tiger salamander, the spotted salamander, marbled salamander, carpenter frog, gray tree frog, and the barking tree frog. All breed in these ponds. So to summarize, the majority of our rare plants in Delaware occur in non-tidal freshwater wetlands, in wetlands such as coastal plain seasonal ponds, where you find rare plants like Ranunculus flabellaris, known from only 2 ponds in the whole state. So that concludes my my presentation. I hope I probably went over, but I apologize if I did. Should I stop sharing the screen and so we can move on to Matt?
Yes, please.
Okay.
All right. Well, that was really great. Great insight into the Flora of Delaware that we are looking to help preserve. And now we're going to get another brief introductory presentation from Matt Sarver about some work he did identifying the bees that live on plants in Mount Cuba's gardens. Matt?
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we did at Mount Cuba, 2018, 2019, the study there, and also a little bit about some other recent invertebrate work that I've done in the state and kind of where that leads us in terms of what we know about invertebrates, what we don't know, and what we need to find out, which the short answer is a lot. I'll perhaps start by saying I don't have a slide in here for this, but having heard what Bill said, you know, we have the same situation with invertebrates that we have with plants, where we have a large proportion of species that are historical, that haven't been documented in many, many years in the state. We also have an even larger percentage of the invertebrates that we haven't even studied. The nearest data for us is in Pennsylvania, where the estimates there are that 76% of all the animal species in the state and as much as 53% of the overall species are insects. And there are, you know, on the order of 160 plus thousand insects known in the US. So tremendous share of the biodiversity, for sure. I'm going to talk specifically mostly about bees. There are about 4,000 species in North America. We have over 200 known in Delaware. There are well over 400 known in Maryland, so that tells you that we do have some work to do, although Maryland does have a little bit more physiographic diversity and size than us, but surely more to find. Bees are closely linked to plants, just like if you were here last week for Doug Talamy's talk, and if you heard Doug's talk before, you know how tightly Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, are linked to plants for their larval resources. Well, the same is true of many bees. There are a number of bees that are generalists that will collect their pollen for their young from a variety of plants, but there are also a large percentage that are specialists, or what we call oligolectic, where they collect pollen from only oftentimes a single genus of plants. So, you know, put my Doug Tallamy hat on, if you don't have penstemon species, you're not going to have the bees that rely on them. So this is Osmia distincta. This is a small mason bee that uses only pollen from members of the genus penstemon. This was a species that we found new to the state during our work at Mount Cuba, and it's actually around. I mean, we collected several of them on a couple of different species of penstemon. We don't know the conservation status for a lot of these species because there just isn't enough data. Another thing that you've all heard about, Doug last week talked about the insect apocalypse. He talked about, light pollution and some of the causes for night flying insects. The same thing is happening with bees and pollinators in very dramatic cases. In some instances, like the rusty patch bumblebee, that's declined from almost all of its historic range. A species that was common in Ithaca, New York when I was a student at Cornell, and now is gone from all but a few areas in the Midwest and in the mountains of West Virginia. So we need to know more about invertebrates in order to conserve them. The threats are numerous and fairly evident, including non-native plants, habitat loss, etc. I would add, importantly to this list for the purposes of our discussion today, lack of knowledge on status, distribution, basic life history, and biology of these species, and lack of taxonomic expertise, because there's only so many people out there that can identify these things. So these are areas that we really need to improve upon. So what do we have to do? Well, Mount Cuba had the foresight that they wanted to know more about the native bees at their garden and natural lands. And so we did a 2-year project in 2018, 2019. With a variety of methods, we went out and put these little bowl traps out, which essentially mimic a flower. The bee falls into it thinking it's a flower, gets stuck in what's essentially soapy water, and we go out and collect them. It's a standard method. You put transects out like that. Not all bees will come to them, though, especially some of the specialists. So we have to go out and individually net bees off of target plants. This takes a little bit of expertise on what you're looking for and hunting the proper bees on the proper plants. We spent a lot of time doing that. We looked at both 2 sites within the main garden area at Mount Cuba, the Woods Path area and the area of the Meadow Garden, with these methods. And we also looked at the outlying large amount of contiguous natural areas that Mount Cuba has. And we looked specifically at one of those habitats that Bill mentioned, the Piedmont Stream Valley wetlands. There's a seepage meadow over on the Red Clay Reservation that has a high diversity of native plants. So we surveyed there. We also surveyed a site in the Red Clay Creek floodplain over near Hoops Reservoir. And what we found in 2 seasons of working on this is almost 3,500 individual bee specimens representing 135 species. So, well over half the known diversity in the state so far. And importantly, a total of 15 species previously unrecorded in Delaware, either in the literature or museum specimens and so forth. About 7 of these species are plant specialists, and on various things from dogwoods to willows to native rhododendrons. And I'm going to go through just a couple examples of some of the most interesting things. I don't know how many people know this plant. This is Polemonium reptans, Jacob's ladder or Greek valerian. It's a common spring ephemeral floodplain species in mesic and wet sites throughout the mid-Atlantic and out into the Midwest. Beautiful little early spring plant. And it has a bee associated with it. And this is the distribution of that bee, exclusive of the 2 dots in Delaware, which represent our work. You can see that this bee has never before been recorded east of the Appalachian chain. So the vast majority of the records are out in the upper Midwest, few records in Ohio, and 1 or 2 very recent records in eastern West Virginia. So we found a lot of these bees on Polemonium at Mount Cuba. We looked specifically for it, and we collected, I think, 30 or 40 specimens, both sexes. So it's here, and it's surely in between, but no one has done the survey work. Now we have the invertebrate folks at the Pennsylvania Heritage Program wanted to look for this in Pennsylvania. I'm going to be looking for it up at Chanticleer Garden in Pennsylvania this spring as well. And it's a beautiful bee. It looks like this. It's a small bee, but this sort of understated blue metallic sheen to it. Really a nice looking little animal. Another example from the Mount Cuba study, many of you are probably familiar with heuchera, common garden species grown in a number of cultivars, but there are two native species, Americana and Velosa, that are native throughout the Northeast, primarily in the mountains, but also well beyond. And they have a bee specializing on them. The distribution of that bee is more widespread, but it's quite rare. And up until our study, there were no records, no modern records in the Northeast anywhere for this bee. All of the specimen records were a half century or more old. There was a specimen record for Delaware, so it's not a new species for the state, but it's a new species for the entire Northeast region in terms of modern day survey work. We're the first people who have found this thing northeast of the Shenandoah Mountains, where there have been a few recent finds in the Appalachians there. So this is significant, and this is a species. There it is. It's a photo I took at Mount Cuba. That when I was under contract with the Division of Fish and Wildlife, working on the Wildlife Action Plan, I sort of took on bees because there was no one to do it at the time. And working with Sam Droege and other state folks in other states, we decided to list this species in the State Wildlife Action Plan, even though there were no modern records in Delaware. And lo and behold, we went and looked for it, and there it was, happy in the gardens there at Mount Cuba. Seems to only use those wild type species. I have not been able to find it on the cultivars, although more effort there is certainly warranted. So there were a bunch of other species really cool that we found in that study. I don't have time to go into all of them. Those are kind of the two biggest highlights. But I want to also mention that, it's not just Mount Cuba. Mount Cuba has spectacular share of these kinds of species because of how great their garden is. But, I did some work for Delaware Wildlands recently on a restoration plan. And just while I was down there, I incidentally collected some bees, maybe only 150 specimens. One of the things that I got, because I said, no, that's odd, I got to grab that, is this thing, Trichusa dorsalis. It's this big, bulky black and yellow bee. And it's thought to specialize on trailing wild bean, Strophus stylis. This thing is known, that's its complete distribution. Our record's not shown on there yet, but that's its complete known distribution ever in Eastern North America. There's fewer than a dozen records total. Surely more common, but we don't know where, we don't know how it's doing, we don't know how its habitats are doing. This story just repeats itself over and over again. We, that same project with Delaware Wildlands, we looked for rare skipper because it's in southern New Jersey, right across the street. This is a globally rare species, a G3, I believe, by NatureServe. And there's one site in Delaware, it's a state endangered species in Delaware, known from a site at Woodland Beach Wildlife Area. That site has not been resurveyed in over 20 years. Because the state does not have the resources to send someone there to see if that species is even still extant at its only known location. So we found this thing, and sure enough, it was their second known site in the state for that endangered species. So there's just a tremendous amount of work to be done out there on invertebrates. And I had a slide from that Delaware Wildlands project that I wanted to throw in here because I thought it illustrated the point quite well, just not even with invertebrates, but beyond. Delaware has about a million acres. Mount Cuba's got a couple thousand acres now. This property that I was working on is about 4,500 acres. There's small pieces that have been intensively surveyed. This one in particular is 0.3% of the state. We documented over 21% of the state's flora and over a quarter of the vertebrates of concern for the Northeast region. And we barely scratched the surface on invertebrates. So we're not doing the work that we need to do. There's a lot more we can do collaboratively on this because we're a small state. We need to work collaboratively. We need to work with consultants, with amateur naturalists, with people in their backyards using things like iNaturalist. And I want to just, for the purposes of the discussion later, I wanted to introduce just a thought or an idea. I've been in talks recently with the folks who run the Maryland Biodiversity Project, and they've done a tremendous job of pulling in all this data from so many sources, including iNaturalist, that now ingests data from iNaturalist, and they're able to generate these atlas-like maps with different blocks showing where species are more common. Just an idea for the kind of thing we could be doing here if we invested somewhat in the architecture and set up some data sharing and collaboration tools that would help us understand the diversity patterns of not just the invertebrates, but all the species, plant and animal, in the state. Um, so I'll leave it there. I just want to also call out. I think that Jay Davis from Fish and Wildlife is on the call, but he recently, as part of a Barron's study that the state was participating in, a regional study of sandy habitats, found another new bee species for the state. This beautiful thing, um, Protendrina abdominalis, which is a specialist in these sandy habitats and hasn't been documented in this immediate area for something like a century. So much to be known and described still, probably new species out there. And just imagine if we were finding all these things that were birds that hadn't been seen in 75 years, 100 years, unknown, east of the mountains. People would be losing their minds. So I think we just really have to think about how little we know about some of these invertebrates and how what that means for our understanding of conservation ecology. So I think I'll stop there, and I know we've got lots to talk about in the breakouts.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. It's fascinating to see what you've learned in trying to track the insects that are pollinating our native species, and it really validates a lot of the work we're doing to replenish native species in our local region. And it also, I think, these two presentations also set up this next session of breakouts very well, because I think what it points out to me is the importance of understanding the biodiversity that we have in order to be more intelligent and strategic about the conservation efforts that we make, both individually as organizations and individuals, and collectively and collaboratively. So with that, I think we're going to break people out into a number of smaller rooms for discussion. And let me just show you, here's what we are hoping to discuss. We have two discussion questions that we came up with for these small groups to think about, and please, I think we have, could one person in each breakout group act as the recorder and ideally the reporter, because at the end of this, we're going to come back into one room and share out the ideas that we had in each of the small rooms. So the first question is, what are the top 3 opportunities by which Delaware's conservation community could improve our conservation of native species in natural areas? And the second question is, what would it take in people, funding, equipment, and other materials to activate these initiatives? So most simply, if we are trying to bring together our collective expertise and bandwidth in the service of collaborative conservation, what are the opportunities that this group can imagine that would potentially have the greatest impact for the effort that we put into it? And secondly, what are the resources that would be necessary in order to bring those best ideas into fruition? So with that, does anybody have questions in the chat before we go into this? Where's my chat? I don't see anything. So I guess, Gordon, if you could help break us out into the small rooms. Here's what we're going to do for timing is right now it is 1:32. Let's do this for until 2 o'clock. So it's about 28 minutes. If groups get done a little bit early and want to take a little break, that's fine. But we will aim to reconvene all together in one big room at 2 o'clock, and then we'll talk through the ideas that people came up with and where we'll go from this next. So that's the plan. Let's do it. So what we want to do now is take turns sharing out what was discussed in each room and what ideas came up, the best ideas that people came up with. So I think because the rooms were conveniently numbered, we can do it numerically. So whoever was at table number 1, could you guys give us a little report on what you came up with?
Hi, I think that's me. It's Elan. We were in group 1. We had some really good discussion. I think a lot of our ideas seem to coalesce easily around 3 themes. The one that got the most discussion was increasing citizen science programs. Some of the concepts there were the use of a program such as iNaturalist. If just more general public were out using that data collection set on trails, that would provide us a lot more data. Government scientists might be able to pool this type of data out of that program. But we need to let people know that certain projects exist. There's already good projects there. The publicity on those projects could be a little bit better. Similar in the citizen science theme, talked about expanding the Master Naturalist program, getting more volunteers into the program, getting more organizations that are able to be host organizations. It really, we can cultivate more interest in that. And the folks that come out of those programs tend to be leaders by example in their neighborhoods and spark conversations in their areas. And in the same vein, citizen science, we talked about also BioBlitz topics. They can be really good citizen science programs, but there can be some pushback if you need to harm or capture specimens in order to do identification. So that was one thing that generated a lot of discussion. Another was talking about education. So continuing speaker programs such as easy library presentations. One example that came up was the Sussex Bird Club. If we can keep these things even virtual, there's been a lot more ability to attend these types of events during the COVID period. Education includes things such as signage at parks, like why is the habitat planted a certain way that it is? And that's really useful. And you don't need a person there explaining it as ways to have alternative outreach. And then lastly, we talked about preserving habitat and increasing the value of natural lands, things like conservation easements. Essentially, we need to build a massive contiguous space, a critical mass of contiguous space. We talked a little bit about the Forest Land Preservation Program and the Open Space Preservation Program. So those are the 3 main highlights. What would it take? Money was a big concern, but also people power is kind of the community network. And getting volunteers that want to engage. We know we have a lot of people out there, and so how do we capture the folks that are happy to come out and do something like a tree planting? Thanks.
Great, thank you. That's excellent. I hope everybody knows their table numbers, otherwise this system isn't going to work. But if there's somebody from table 2 who knows they're from table 2, could you please give us a little report on what you guys found? Maybe somebody doesn't know who is at table 2. How about table 3?
I can call out table participants if that's helpful.
Oh yeah, sure.
All right, table 2, you're on the spot. I see Dave, Karen, Kelly, Lee, Lisa, and Steve.
Well, I'm table 3 if table 2 wants to figure out who they are.
That's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead,
Okay.
Eileen.
I'm Eileen. We had a great discussion, and it kind of revolved around the role in government. How do you engage the people, and how we need to know what each other are doing. So those were kind of the 3 things. So the role in government, we talked a little bit about funding, and could you maybe in land development fees or tagging, chicken farmers or some kind of, like if you're doing some kind of environmental harm, can you get money to go back into environmental causes? And some of us were trying to say we could do this together, but there was some kind of sadness that we're not doing this fast enough. So the role of government was a little important thing to think about. The next was like, how can you engage people? And so we did also talk about citizen science and what a good idea it is to do for rare plants and that kind of thing. But we also talked that that's difficult because you need that knowledge gap. When, you know, Matt is showing you little bees, well, you could get people to catch the bees, but they couldn't figure out what the heck they were. They had to give them to Sam Drogi. So the training piece has to be part of that as well. Another way of engaging people that we talked about was starting with kids and outreach programs, and how can you teach kids when they're young that this kind of stuff is important, and not to be afraid of the bees, and get outside. So and then the last way that we talked about engaging the people was about like a WPA kind of thing, like maybe with the COVID relief plan, is there a way that we could get money from federal governments or whatever to actually train people to become you know, a core of conservationists. So there was the free volunteer idea, and then there was the, you know, the paid idea. And then we ended up with this idea of, we kind of need to know what each other is doing. So this idea of a clearinghouse, of connecting the dots between all our various organizations, where you could say, okay, volunteers, I need, you know, my group needs trained weed warriors to come over, and somebody could, you know, sign in to some website or whatever and make a request. Also, you could do training there. You could share your equipment. Say you're a natural lands manager and you don't have the right tractor. If some other group has it, maybe we could share equipment. So, you know, it's always about the money, but what we all do have is expertise. We all bring something to the table. And so if we could learn how to share that, that was our discussion.
Great. Those are good ideas. Is there somebody here from table 4?
Okay, that would be me. We had a good discussion as well, and I'm sure a lot of these things are going to be repeated, so hopefully we'll have a theme as we go along.
Hopefully.
The top 3 opportunities for the first question we talked about in very basic terms was, how do we continue to preserve existing habitat, and how do we connect our fragmented habitats? So reducing habitat fragmentation needs to be a priority, and there's a lot of ways in which we need to engage. The most land is privately owned, so how do we incentivize private landowners to do conservation easements or do projects on their private property to make this type of work happen? Again, how do we knuckle down even more on invasive species control so we don't outcompete the native species? How do we already have a list of priority areas that need to be preserved, or habitats of concern. The other one was again, education. What are incentive programs out there for private landowners? We've already heard about and how do we get citizens and involved people. We already heard about master naturalists and other programs out there, and the other idea about what are we all doing, and knowing more about what each other's doing and having some more coordination. As far as some of the, let me find the second question here, was some of the ways to accomplish this. Well, first of all, legislation. There's still the big thing that was mentioned was freshwater wetlands, and they're still unprotected. There needs to be legislation on that to protect freshwater wetlands. Connecting people, we talked about that earlier, connecting people with the groups, and also funding is needed to do all this. There's not a whole lot of funding that's geared in programs outside of state lands and lands that are being managed by NGOs. A lot of the private landowners that may want to do this kind of work, there are not a lot of programs out there where there's incentives or programming or funding to help them accomplish something on their property. So that's kind of the basic things in a nutshell.
That's really great. Thank you very much. Group 5, table 5.
I think we were table 5. All right, so I'm also starting to see some commonalities in the points that we're making here. So for us, our 3 main ideas were reaching people who are outside of the conservation community. So we were lucky enough to have 2 people in our group who are working with the Sacred Grounds program, which was new to me, but they're sort of piloting this program in Trolley Square in the Wilmington area. And this is one of sort of, if we go on to like the question 2 part of things for this point, you know, they're doing a lot to leverage sort of the faith community and the work that they do outreaching through their churches. And then they're also working with some grant programs to create corridors and green spaces within the Wilmington community. And then another idea that we had was, you know, right now the environmental justice movement is sort of picking up speed, and it would also be useful to sort of leverage that with reaching communities who aren't necessarily within the conservation community either. Another point that we had was reaching private landowners to conserve species outside of sort of legislation efforts that have been unsuccessful in the past. Ways in which this might happen, or things that we would need to sort of get this rolling. We had someone mention using conservation districts within each county to sort of figure out like where, you know, we could reach landowners and that kind of thing. Collaborating with agricultural community and the NRCS. We didn't have as much time to talk about that one for question 2. And then our final point was, so increasing the state's capacity for open space conservation, which has been mentioned, I believe. So funding was a big mention here. And then also increasing their capacity for biological surveys. We tacked that on at the end, but that seemed to be a huge need in our community. So some of the question 2 points for this was, at least for the state's funding for open space, the program hasn't been sort of updated, I guess, in 20 to 25 years. So we're sort of saying that they should increase the funding, potentially like $5 million more, just because, you know, a lot of time has passed and there's a lot of projects that need to be addressed. So also political will without, revenue return requests. So Recovering America's Wildlife Act was mentioned a few times. And then, you know, to kind of get this rolling again, people just in the conservation community calling legislators. And that was another sort of need to get that to happen. So I think that was it for us.
Excellent. I'm glad that there are themes emerging. If there were no themes emerging, I would be worried. So this is good. Is there a table 6?
Hi, yes, table 6. And yes, same themes. We kind of just talked about why is the habitat continuing to be lost? And there was kind of 2 thoughts, either knowledge and education. So perhaps they need to be educated from multiple sides. Like obviously if the government is just trying to educate, sometimes that is taken in a different way than if someone else, nonprofit, more educational people were doing the educating of like landowners and things like that. So collaboration, opportunity for collaboration there, but then also just the education about what programs exist for land conservation may not be readily available or I don't know, how are they getting it, but also those other non-government organizations who are also interested in conservation are just generally not maybe educated on the state or government programs that already exist. Just in our group, we certainly didn't know all of them. So just putting that education to more than just the direct landowners, the general conservation community perhaps needs to know about them more broadly as we talk to people in the state. And then so that was more from the education side, but then also being lost from probably a financial side, because and so where's the financial need there? Does the state not have the money to offer enough tax incentives we talked about might not be enough for particularly older people. It might not be worth it. So different sorts of financial incentives might be needed. And then perhaps the state or government can work collaboratively with other organizations to raise funds to buy property if that's needed. Those were kind of the big things we talked about. A lot of things and then just the laws in general. A lot of the local governments seem to be restricted by what they can do with open space. It needs to be active use or something like that, not necessarily open for just straight conservation. Perhaps looking into that. And then just in general, someone else mentioned know what each other are doing, particularly when we all have strengths from from a lobbying, legislative perspective, and then others more good at the on the boots conservation side, and just needing to know kind of what's always what is going on with everybody. Oh, and then right at the end, we started talking about getting more corporations involved in maybe the financial side of things, but we kind of ran out of time at the end of that.
Fantastic, thank you. It's a great list. Okay, that brings us to group 7.
That was us, Jeff.
That was us.
Yes. All right. So again, most of this was already said, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm just going to tell you the 4 main categories of needs that we saw that could make the most impact. The first thing that we talked about was large landowners and the need to work with them more to capture our species. We talked about the barriers that exist working with private landowners. It's a little ironic that our federal endangered species law prevent anyone from reducing an endangered species to personal ownership, yet that is exactly what we do with our private land laws. And we saw an opportunity to work with our legislative bodies to come up with ways to get around those private landowner laws. The second thing was land management needs. Specifically, we were focused on removing invasives, but we did talk about the need for a task force or some kind of working body that could help with that. We talked about monitoring and recording biodiversity in the state. We talked about how different categories of species are treated differently, are not monitored the same or to the same extent. And then finally, we mentioned the need for information sharing again, the need for uniform information collecting, and for that information to be pushed back out to people. In terms of resources that we would require for these things, we talked about the need for expertise, not just for experts to be created, but for them to be connected with volunteers in the communities that they serve. We absolutely talked about citizen science and a lot of the things that would be needed from casting that broad net of information, trying to bring information together. And then finally, we spoke about enacting laws and working with this group to work with our governing bodies in our legislature to increase funding for programs that already exist, such as DENREC and those other things that do hire the experts already, but are often one-person shows for the entire state or for the entire region, and it's just not enough to cover what we actually need to monitor or keep an eye on. That's everything.
Excellent, thank you. Was there a table 8?
Yes. Table 8, that's me. And yes, there are themes coming through. We talked about education and briefly celebrated the SB 22 that was signed last week. Yes, it's an important bill. We know about it, but how many others know about it, and how will the general public find out about it? Our top 3 opportunities were education. And yes, the bill was spoken about, but also landowners and organizations. We also talked about the importance of monitoring, that yes, it's great that we have some baselines, but not having those check-ins is important for us to continue moving forward. We also talked about invasive species removal. After hearing Bill McAvoy this morning, we understand the importance and what impact invasives are having on our habitats. When we talked about what will it take, we talked about people and funding, both people being educated and needing to be trained so that they could volunteer, as well as what does it look like if there were to be groups. I know Colin spoke with us, and then Lorraine Fleming mentioned it again today about something like a CCC Corps that could work on areas so that projects, removal, plantings could be done en masse, because what's being done is wonderful, but it's a small percentage of what needs to be done. So that was group 8.
Excellent. I think there were only 8 groups. There was
Yes,
no
and
group.
is there anyone from group 2 that wanted to share?
The secretive group 2. Okay. So
Wait a minute. I've
what's
got
that?
something to say.
Oh, great.
I'm Karen, and in our group, we talked about it begins with us in our own backyards, building our gardens for the pollinators, the birds, the native plants. It starts with us, and from there, it usually branches out. And we felt like going into the schools at a young age and involving the children so that they could touch and feel and learn about gardening. Anything interactive with gardening stimulates them, and they become interested, and it continues into hopefully their long life. The other themes that have been talked about, we did as well. And that's about as much as I can remember.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. So we have a lot of great emerging themes. The things that occurred to me as I was writing things down as furiously as I could, if we had been in person, the way we had originally intended, we could have written all these things down on a whiteboard and gotten all crazy with figuring out what fits with what. But I just to recap some of the themes that I was hearing was resources. You know, the idea to push for greater dollars and people to help do the important work that needs to be done. Communication was a key that came up over and over, better communication among all of us. And the good news for that is that the last part of this meeting here is to find a path forward for us to do that better and more intentionally going forward. The private landowners and finding incentives or ways to create greater access to be able to do surveys on a greater portion of the land that in Delaware to better understand what's going on. But then the monitoring in general, the idea that if we're going to be successful in conservation, we're going to need to know as well as possible what's going on out there. What is the current state of our biodiversity if we want to be able to figure out how to nudge it in the right direction going forward, and also to know if it's working. You know, we're not going to know if our nudges work if we don't know where we started. So that becomes an important thing as well. And a number of other things. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize all of this and recirculate it around to everybody. And I think it'll give us a good sense of a lot of interesting ideas. But the last part of today's meeting, what we hope to accomplish is to turn this energy, this wonderful positive energy that is here together today in this virtual setting, and turn it into a working group where we at least what we're hoping to do is to solicit some volunteers to form a working group to talk about these ideas in an ongoing basis. And we don't know exactly what that means. It's going to be in part up to the working group to figure out what that means. But the idea is to have a group that of conservation professionals and interested citizens of Delaware that comes together in some sort of a meeting form, whether it's in person in the future or virtual always, because it's easier, but to come together on a regular basis, just to talk about these things, make sure that we're making progress on them, and to find ways to foster those communication streams to be able to better understand what everyone else is doing and who has kind of additional resources that others could put to use, so that we can improve the way we go about all of this. One of the primary ambitions of the Native Species Commission is to develop a website, which could form as a hub for this network, and kind of a place where we can, kind of establish a communication center with resources and all of that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, talking about resources, the Native Species Commission in 2020 or the 2019-2020 fiscal year was given the huge amount of $25,000 with which to kind of move our conservation efforts forward. And unfortunately, we spent about half of that last year ramping up the summit meeting that we were hoping to have in person, that then had to be ramped back down when COVID interfered with all of our lives and forced us to rethink what we were doing. So we've used a bunch of the rest of that money to kind of come together and make this meeting happen. And the rest of the summit related events, the event last week and the event next week. So there's not a whole lot of money left over. And when we tried to scrape the bottom of our budget barrel, we didn't have enough to put together the website. So we're hopeful. Senator Hansen has been working to try to ensure that the Native Species Commission has money, some sort of a budget going forward, which wouldn't be a lot, but it would be greater than zero. But I think getting a website together would be a great start to have a place to communicate more effectively together. However, what I am looking for is a brave soul to volunteer to be the initial coordinator of this working group. And what that would entail would be sharing your email address so that others who are interested in participating in this voluntary working group could reach out to you after the panel by email to start the process of developing the next meeting of this group, or at least the smaller working group. It doesn't have to be everybody here that's in the working group, but we will potentially want to bring this group back together occasionally just to keep everyone informed and keep our efforts moving forward. So we're not exactly sure what form all of this is going to take. And this is the amazing quality of internet virtual meetings where you don't have it all scripted out. So is there a brave soul out there who would be willing to be the initial coordinator for this land, like natural area preservation group, I guess we could call it, or something?
I can be a volunteer, Jeff.
Who is that, Julie?
That's Lucy.
Lucy. Hey, Lucy.
Hey.
That would be fantastic.
And if anyone else wants to as well, we can be a duo, a trio. Doesn't have to just be one.
That is true too. Anyway, we can start with that. So Lucy, would you be willing to share your email address in the chat? And then anybody else who is interested in joining this group can get in touch with you later. And then you and I can catch up after this about what that might look like. And we can think about when we would want to schedule the next meeting of this working group who's going to, I think what's going to happen, this is all just kind of a work in progress, but what I'm imagining is that we'll take these ideas that we've put together today and kind of prioritize them and think about, which are the ones that this working group might be able to make the most progress on in the near term, and start from there and whittle away at it. I think that's as much as we needed to get going. But the point of all of this is to start working more collaboratively together and to be in better touch so that we can better communicate and have a greater understanding so that we can further all of our efforts a little more productively and with greater information. So I think this has been a great start. I'm looking for comments. Lots of thank yous for our brave volunteer, Lucy Dinsmore, way to go. Yeah, so I think we've done what we needed to do today, and I'm looking forward to the next phase of this work in progress adventure. I think one of the common things we've heard in the last year is flying a plane while building it, or building the plane while flying. I think that's kind of what's happening here. But I think we're on the right track. So thank you everybody for spending the time coming to this virtual meeting. Lucy, I will reach out to you and we can chat about next steps. All right. Thank you, everybody. I hope you register if you're interested. The next session is next week. It's in the morning instead of the afternoon. And that one is going to be on conservation in the built environment. This is going to be more about like the conservation in your backyard, the Doug Tallamy kind of, how can we all work together to increase native species and improve biodiversity. So thanks again. Hope to see you next week.